So hello, everybody. I'm Christy Craig. I'm the publisher here at Hidden Timber Books. I want to welcome you again to one of our small press author reading events. Thank you for being with us on a Sunday afternoon. I'm excited to have Patricia Ann McNair here today to talk about her new book, Responsible Adults. It's a short story collection from Cornerstone Press, and it has received the Distinguished Favorite Award from the Independent Press Awards of 2021 in the category of short stories. So that's pretty exciting. I've read her work before. This is the third book that I have of hers. I love her as a writer, and I love these stories, and certainly that award is well deserved, Patty. So just to give you a little bit about Patricia Ann McNair, she has managed a gas station, served as a medical volunteer in Honduras, sold pots and pans door to door, tended bar and breaded mushrooms, worked on the trading floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and now teaches in the English and Creative Writing Department of Columbia College, Chicago. McNair's Temple of Air received Southern Illinois University's Devil's Kitchen Readers Award and the Chicago Writers Association Book of the Year Award. Her collection of essays, And These Are the Good Times, was a Montaigne Medal finalist. She lives in Chicago with her husband, visual artist Philip Hartigan. So thank you again for being here, Patty. I want to just ask you, first of all, just to tell us a little bit about who you are and kind of what you've been doing during the last year to stay creative, as you were waiting for this book to come out and things like that. What has kept you in that frame of mind?
That's a great question, Christy. And I think I'll start. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I think what you do is so important. You're one of the best literary citizens that I know in terms of inviting people to be part of communities, various communities. As you said, we met each other quite a number of years ago because you had interviewed somebody, Megan Steelstra, whom I love quite a lot. And then we connected through that. And so you do a number of interviews and these series. And then now you're the publisher of Hidden Timber Books with your first title coming out, which is amazing. So thank you for letting me be part of this. So being creative this last year, I suppose I should start my answer with a bit of a confession in that I don't feel I've been as creative as I had intended to be at the beginning of this pandemic. And maybe I'm the only one who feels this way. I'm like, oh, I have all this time. I don't have to commute to school. It gives me all these hours left in the weeks, which first of all isn't true because teaching remotely for 14 months, the end of the last spring semester last year and both semesters this year, has actually been a lot more work and a lot more time consuming than when I'm actually in campus or on campus, because on campus you just pull somebody aside, you have a conversation, and now so all of my creativity, I shouldn't say all my creativity, but much of my creativity has gone in designing my learning management system pages, trying to figure out how best to engage my students in the remote activities that we do, think about things they can do on their own so they feel like they're part of an education community and also of a literary community. And so what that means is that I haven't made new work very much in the last year, little more than a year. And so I feel incredibly lucky that Responsible Adults was coming out in December, because as Kim would be able to tell you and Catherine will be able to tell you soon, that it's such a hands-on process with their editors that it forced me to think about my stories in new ways. And so as I was revising and working with the editors, that really helped me feel like I was making some new work, even though I was working with existing stories. And I don't know about you, Christy, because you're a fabulous writer yourself, but if I'm not making new work, some people love the whole editing process and the revision process, but if I'm not discovering something new or making new work, it just doesn't feel nearly as satisfying to me. So working with those editors really helped me sort of figure some things out and to see these stories in new ways and discover new things about the stories. And even though in some cases they were very small fixes, but putting the book together and moving things around and all of that is all part of the creative process as well. And then I've been lucky too that I've had a number of really interesting interviews, online interviews, and that you have to write answers to and you think about. So that helps me think about my idea of what writing is and work with that. But I also started a new novel. I've set one novel aside And now I started a new novel pretty much just a couple of months before the pandemic. And I was working on it pretty hard. And then the pandemic hit. And then I wasn't. And then I had an opportunity. I thought about it a lot, right? So we're always carrying our stories with us. But I did have an opportunity for a Ragdale residency in the beginning of January this year. And it helped me just sort of dig right back into it. And then the problem after that was then I had to come back to the real world of teaching again. But now, even just last weekend, I have some writing gal pals, and we've all been vaccinated, and so we did an imposed retreat, and lo and behold, I found my way back into that novel again. It hasn't been as productive a creative time for me, but I have sort of found my way in the cracks and crevices, but have found my way into the creativity that way. And I am aching now, like all of us are, to really be able to turn my attention back. The semester's almost over, grades are just about in, and now I'm going to really dig into this novel in progress again and try to find myself, try to find my way and feel like a creative person again as much as I can.
Thank you. I love hearing about, and Catherine said the same thing about how revisions is a way to feel like you're making new work. I think that's great. I think a lot of people are afraid of revisions, and in fact, sometimes that's the best part of the process is really discovering that deeper part of the story. And Ragdale's awesome. It's such a beautiful place. I've only been there once to do a workshop with you, but I've heard you talk a lot about it. I've heard other people talk about the residencies. It's just that's a great place to be able to explore your work as well.
Yeah, it very much is.
Why don't we hear a reading from you? And what I'm going to do is spotlight you so that if you want to turn on your speaker view, Patty's lovely face will be the only thing that you see.
Thank you. So Christy and I were talking about what might be interesting to read, and one of the things that she had, and perhaps we'll talk some more about this as we go on, but one of the things that she had been talking about that she was intrigued with was the mother and daughter stories. And so I'm going to read an excerpt from one of the mother and daughter stories, and in fact, the title of the story is My Mother's Daughter. So this comes in about 2/3 of the way into the story, and it's just a chunk of the story, but it should stand alone. I think you don't need to know more than what I'm telling you. By the time I was 13, I didn't really fit into little girl clothes anymore. Once at Sears shopping for school, we tucked into the narrow dressing room that smelled like sweat and feet. And my mother gave me a lady's blouse with darts and tucks. And the skirts from the juniors department hugged my hips too tight, even the ones for the chubbies. And I can remember my mom sitting behind me on a stool while I tried things on, and she was crying. "You're growing up," she said to me when I asked, but now I think it had more to do with me getting fat, not grown. "You're not fat," Mom would say when I worried out loud. But I figured she wouldn't tell me even if I was. I wondered if she even knew that she was. "You're zaftig." And I figured maybe that just meant fat in a different language. And so I looked it up. Curvaceous, pleasingly plump. Boys liked me, my fleshy parts that made me different from the other girls. At the roller rink, they'd ask me for couples skate, and sometimes even the moonlight skate when the lights went down and that mirror ball sent fireflies over the walls, the floors, our faces. And we'd circle the rink for a while, and the music was always slow. When I was really young, my mom brought me to the rink on Saturday afternoons for kids skate, and there used to be an organ player, a real guy in a booth near the shoe rental, and he and my mom used to laugh together, and he'd play I Dream Of, and he'd lean toward her and say her name then. And once I watched while she sat next to him on his bench, and he put his hand high on her leg while the other hand spread wide over a few chords. Now, though, it was records all together on a tape that hissed sometimes. And me and a boy would hold hands, palms wet and fingers laced, and he'd guide me off the floor and into a corner where during moonlight, kids would press up against the wall and make out until one of the guards, a high school boy with a whistle and a flashlight, would swoop in to break things up. But before that, one or another of my moonlight partners would put his tongue in my mouth and his hand under the buttons of my blouse. And I knew then the foggy warmth of want. And I leaned into this want, the moist hands on my skin, the hot breath on my neck, the rub and hardness of him, of any him. My mom, her daughter's mother, wanted to be loved. I could see it in her eyes when she'd come to me on those nights when she'd met someone. They were shiny and blinking, like she'd just seen something so bright it stunned her. And under her perfume and smoke and the greasy fried smell she wore home from the diner was something else, a scent like honey and nuts. Her love smell, I called it, but not out loud, just to myself. And on those nights of her love smell and blinking eyes, she'd wake me up if I wasn't still there on the couch, watching late night movies with Shanty on my knee, feeling her ribs through her fur, and her small hands would stroke and pat me while she told me about him, any him. He's new in town, she'd say, or he's a businessman, or he's smart, ever hopeful, always optimistic. Once it was the insurance man who came into the diner after she'd gone to his office about Grandpa's policy, the little pile of money in her name. He wore shiny white shoes that looked like plastic, and he had sandy hair that circled a pink bald spot on the top of his head. He called my mom Doll up until the time he left because she wouldn't give him money to pay his rent. Another time, the man she met stole our car while she slept him off. And another time, a woman showed up at our door in the morning while the guy sat at our table drinking coffee and eating the runny yellow eggs my mother had made for him. He winked at me and told us he'd called his wife to come and pick him up. And mom would swear off guys for a little while then, but I never did. Even when I started to hear things at school, small whispers behind my back in the halls, girls talking in the bathroom when they didn't know I was in there. You can guess the things they said, the names they called me, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth that climbed and filled my insides in the dark corners of the roller rink, behind the bus garage at the edge of school property, in the back seats of cars we'd find with their doors unlocked at night. I'd come home breathless and sticky with sweat, grass in my hair, buttons undone, and the house would be empty except for my cat Shanty, until my mother came home from work, bored and lonely and ready to break her fast, eager to meet someone new. She liked her men skinny, like we used to be, like my father was, and they'd slide in and out of our life like a cat through a door barely opened.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think what I love about your stories are your characters. A lot of the characters in this book, like the younger characters in this book, seem to have so much more insight than the adults. And and it's true in that, in this story, mothers and daughters are just the daughter seems to see things a little more clearly, and the mother seems a little bit, not quite there. And I just wonder, in thinking about that story and thinking about some of the others, the different characters that you have, even some of the past books that you've read, the Temple of Air, or that you've written, the Temple of Air, and this book, they have you have a great voice. And not only do you write about, the details of just like the space around the characters that really tell a lot of the story. I'm thinking about the two kids in the back of the car.
Responsible adults.
Tommy, oh, is that the one? Okay. So I'm just curious, like, how do you, where do you come up with your characters, and where do the story ideas come from? Because the one about responsible adults is so unique and different. And, I'd love to hear a little bit about where you discover your characters. That's a long, winding way to ask a question.
That's fine. Because that's not entirely different from the way I come up with my characters. It's kind of a long and winding process as well. I am, you may already know this about me, Christy, but I am there's part of me that's stuck a little bit in the little girl mode or in the teenage girl mode from a variety of reasons, probably psychologically a little. My father died when I was 15. And I just find that, and I've worked with young people for more than 30 years now, from little kids to college age students. There's just something so fascinating, I think, about the emerging awareness of kids as they grow up, how much they know and how much more they know. And especially in that in-between time, like in this story, where, we know so much, we see so much, we understand so much, and we also know so little, and we see so little, and we don't really know a lot about ourselves. We're eager to pass judgment and understand everybody else's motivations, but we don't really know that much about ourselves. So I would think that, as I think about it now, the narrators, the first person narrators of those young women, usually and occasionally, I use a guy now and again, but I'm aware that they probably are not particularly reliable when it comes to themselves. They're probably not really reliable when it comes to themselves, but they are absolutely willing to out other people, right? Or to say whatever they have to say about other people. So there are those things, I think, that are drive my characters a lot and my stories. I also am a person who I get a lot of ideas from like news stories and current events and various things. And sometimes they're more evident in the stories that I write, and other times they're more sort of abstractions of something that I read or something that I've seen. An image that I've seen, or a way that I see people on the street behaving with one another. But so, for instance, Responsible Adults, when I first wrote that story, the kids in the backseat of their car and their parents who have essentially left them, that came after, I don't know if you recall, but during the earlier days of the opioid crisis, and there was a few pictures like of parents who had got, they'd OD'd and their kids were in the backseat of their car. They were kind of like middle-class parents and their kids were in the back of the car. So that, I was thinking about that irresponsibility of parents in the front seat and kids in the back. And so that came from that. And then I really wanted to tell it from the little girl's point of view, because she really could not know what was going on. There is a little bit of narrative distance in it later on, where we find out that she's sort of telling the story from some distance, but not a lot of distance. And so she didn't really know what was going on and didn't really know what to expect. And so I was aware of really wanting to stay as close to her voice as I could, or what I thought her voice would be. And I like the young voice. I like their stories and the way that they're sort of positioned in the world. But in Responsible Adults, it starts with very young characters, and then it sort of moves through and kind of flips the point of view. We get more of it from the parents' point of view later on, and aging parent, or these kids as they age. And so there is a sort of a shift in the voices, I think. And I think that's also a shift in my own development. As a writer, I only ever used to write young. And after, I'm like in my 60s now, so I figured it's time for me to write somebody who's a little older than 15 now and again. But there's still a sense of emerging and new understanding and everything that comes through. But the voices in the older stories, the older characters' stories, I think has shifted some.
Yeah, it's funny. You talk about that coming to awareness when you're younger, but I mean, I think even now there's a coming to an awareness that as you grow older, it's like sometimes I feel like I didn't know anything until I was like 45. And how come, it takes so long to figure things out? But yeah, I love hearing about your process. I wanted to ask you too about, but I want to hear you read again, but actually let's have you read again, and then I'm going to ask my next question.
Okay. So I think I'm going to read one of the slightly older characters telling a story. And this is a character, Dorothy, who Dorothy appears in a few different stories. And usually as an adult of, sometimes a much older adult, like a middle-aged daughter, with her mother. But this one, she's probably in her early 20s in this story. It's called Good Men and Bad. I met a man on the road, one of many. I was 20. Where to, he asked, as most did. He drove a station wagon. In the rear of it, I know this because I always looked closely at the insides of cars before I got in. Clues could be found there, good man or bad. Groceries, good. Filthy magazines, bad. I was usually right. He had blankets and a pillow and a large portrait of Jesus, blonde Jesus, blue-eyed Jesus, in a gold frame, like something you would put over a couch maybe, or a fireplace. Good man, I thought, although I didn't know for certain. The clues were complicated. Next date, I said, hopeful. I leaned in through the passenger side window. I smelled burnt tobacco and sweat and chocolate. Get in, he said. Let's see how far we can get ya. Get, I noticed. He said it like that, get. Bill, he said, and nodded some. I saw his eyes then, dull, yellowed and gray. Dorothy, I said. Smoke? Bill said, and pulled a pack of Marlboros from his shirt pocket. The red on the box was greasy with fingerprints. No thanks, I said. Don't smoke. He turned and looked at me for a second. His eyebrow, the right one, had a scar through it, a white bald line. Sometimes I asked the men I met on the road to tell me the stories of their scars, but that usually came later, once we'd known each other some. I looked Bill over. He wore suit pants and a white shirt, good clothes, church clothes, possibly. It may have been a Sunday. I don't fully recall, but they were threadbare at the spots of most wear, knees, cuffs. Bill was not an old man, I could tell. His hair was the color of the dirt along the banks of the river where I'd slept the night before, brown and rich. Yeah, he looked at the road and slid the pack back into his shirt. Me neither. Whose cigarettes then, I wondered? Whose smoky smell? I felt a prickle of something on the back of my neck. It felt cold and blue. I can feel colors. I felt them since I was a child in the pitch black of my bedroom. My brother's pure white breathing in the twin bed next to mine. My father's voice felt red. My mother's a watery pink. The sighs between them were silver. I put my hands on the top of my backpack on the floorboard at my feet. Beneath the flap, I kept the Bible I'd found on a park bench and protection. Nothing much, small caliber. Enough, though, I discovered along the way. We exchanged small talk. The weather, warm for autumn, the price of gas, high. I can pay my share, I said, in case that was something he wanted. No, not necessary. Keep your money, Bill said. He waved a hand between us. There was black in the lines of his palm, dark circles left from old blisters. If you're sure, I said. He didn't answer. We rode quiet for a while. Been on the road long? Bill asked after a bit. He eyed me in the rear view. Some, I said. You know, I said, just trying to find my way, my place. Where'd you come from? There's no easy answer to this question for me. Just now, most recently, Missouri. I'd worked the door at a bar in St. Louis, but there'd been some trouble, a few fights, some guys. I could have told Bill that. Out west, I said, though, because I thought it was a better answer for what he was asking. My people are from here, though, family, what's left of them. We passed a cemetery with modest stones in rows up a rise of browning grass, plastic flowers in bundles all over them. The sign at the cemetery's edge was one of those anti-abortion kind, with a baby 10 feet high looking over the highway and smiling, shining pink gums and no teeth. Choose life, baby, the sign said. Bill snorted. Yeah, he said, almost too quiet for me, like life's so damn great. Got something on your mind, Bill? I turned to him and he looked at me. He gnawed on the inside of his cheek. The muscles in his temple worked. He wanted to say something, I could tell. People, men on the road, mostly do talk, I'd noticed. They would say things to a stranger in the front seat of their car they never did before. They would tell things no one else knew. I can't say why for sure, but it happens all the time. It's a phenomenon I mean to study closer someday. Nah, Bill said after a bit. He looked back at the road. We drove on without speaking. It was autumn and this was the Midwest, and I was glad for it. I loved the gentleness around us, the amber slopes, the long charcoal stripes of highway that split the harvested cornfields, the grassy ditches that trilled with small life sounds. There was not a mountain in sight. I was glad for that too. I'd been gone too long. I didn't realize I was asleep until I wasn't anymore. Bill's hand was on me, my knee, and he pressed his fingers hard in. Shit, I said before thought came. I struck his hand away. We were driving still. The cornfields had given way to trees, tall and going gold and red. They were fiery streaks through the window, and I knew we were going too fast. Bill, I said. Sorry, I said. You frightened me. When I looked, he was crying. Tears and snot were smeared down his face. His mouth was open like he might scream. I could see the great fillings in his teeth. Oh, he said, more like a moan than a word. Oh, and he drove faster yet. There was no one there but us, not just in his station wagon, but on the highway and the nearby woods, just we two. I learned as a child how to find animals in the forest by looking for horizontal lines among the vertical ones. Trees rise up, animals run across. I thought I saw a deer in the trees, a long stretch of something tawny, but we were going too fast. It might have been a downed log. Bill, I said again. I put my hand on his shoulder, gently, tenderly. I'd done this before, in overture, usually, one of the ways I made money to keep on. He leaned his face against my fingers, my knuckles. He kissed them, and I let him. He eased his foot off the accelerator some. I turned toward him in the seat, readying myself. I saw Jesus over my shoulder, looking away from us, held in place by gold borders. When I put my other hand on Bill's thigh, I felt the heat of him and the sticks of his bones. No, he said, and put his hand on mine. Not that, he said. That's not what I need. And he hiccuped a little. A bit of his crying caught in his narrow chest. Listen, he said. That's what I want. Just listen. As I've said, men on the road like to talk. Bill told me about his niece, whom he'd loved, only unnaturally so, about when he lived with his brother and his brother's family, about the nights he'd enter the little girl's room, hold her when she cried. She was 5, 6. God, he loved her. She lit me, he said. Perhaps he meant that she had let him, but it sounded like lit, and that was most likely true too. All the while he talked, he stroked my hand on his stick thigh. I felt my skin grow raw under his palm. It hurt to sit there. It hurt to listen. Did it matter that the girl loved him too, Bill asked. The question sounded well worn, like he'd asked it dozens of times, to himself at least, perhaps to others. I don't think I was his first. No reason for that, but I just don't think so. Did it matter, he wanted to know? Because she did, he said. She did love him. She made room for him in her bed. She liked to wash his hair in the bathtub. And that's when I thought I might be sick. I told Bill so, and he looked at me in the rearview mirror, eyes on eyes, car sick, I said, but he knew that wasn't it. Soul sick, you mean, he said, and wiped a hand across the slobber on his face. He pulled the car over. I opened the door and grabbed my pack and made it to the weeds in the ditch just as I started to gag. Nothing came up. Bill eased the car back onto the highway and hit the gas. The passenger door slammed as he drove away. A doe leapt across the highway in front of him. I watched. The station wagon screeched and swerved and missed, and then a fawn, small and spotted, was there in the road, and Bill hit her. The impact threw her over the hood of his car, then the roof of it, and she tumbled over the blacktop and onto the shoulder. She stood, and I ran toward her, hopeful, ever hopeful. There's so much resilience in the young, after all. But she ran away, her legs buckling until she fell in the grass at the edge of the trees where the station wagon had come to rest too, its front end broken nearly in two against the solid, broad trunk of a maple. There was silence and then sound. I can never forget that. It comes to me in dreams sometimes, in the glow of my nightlight. It feels thick and purple. I don't know who or what made the sound. It was a wailing, grief-filled and sharp. The fawn's mother stood among the trees. I ran. The fawn stilled in the ditch. Bill bled over his steering wheel. The spreading purple noise could have come from any one of us. I pulled the gun from my pack just in case, but I could see when I was close enough that the fawn was already dead, and mercifully so. I held the gun in my hand and moved toward the car. Bill was alive. Also a small mercy to my mind, because it seemed to me that there must be suffering in Bill. In suffering, he might find forgiveness, I thought. I was so young, remember, I had not yet finished reading the whole of the Bible I'd found. I didn't know yet how things worked. In suffering, he might find peace. God, he might find God. I passed the car and saw that there was blood on the face of Jesus. The gold frame had split apart. I walked on up the road, the grief noise still purple in my ears.
That's a powerful story.
Thank you.
And it brings me to my next question. I'm glad I waited to ask it, because what I notice in a couple of stories like this one and the other stories regarding Alex especially, is that the way that you use color in your stories, and it's not, it's not just in the typical color like the trees tall and glowing golden red, or the gray fillings in his teeth, but it's the pure white breathing. My father's voice felt red. My mother's a watery pink. The sides between them were silver, and even at the end, there was silence and sound. It feels thick and purple. And I don't know if you did that with intention, um, but it's the same in regarding Alex. There's a lot of mention of purple. And I don't know, when I was reading through it, it just kept coming up, and I thought, wow, I want to ask about that. Like, the cover is full of color. So was that intentional? Is that just something that kind of just flows? Do you have any thoughts about the way color works within the stories?
Wow, nobody's ever asked me that before, Christy. That's really interesting. I am very aware of color in my imagining, in my mind's eye. I'm very aware of color, and it plays in different ways. Sometimes it just happens almost instinctively, or like I'm seeing the color and I just write what I see. Other times, like in this one, this idea of the synesthesia, that sounds and things could bear color. I was really interested in that, and I was interested in that for this character. The funny thing about this story is that this character wasn't the first character whose story it was. It was actually initially part of one of my still not figured out novels, and it was a young pastor, who actually has this, who had grown up kind of in a dark, I mean, literally a dark place. Grew up inside of a mountain with his folks, kind of thing, So color was essential to his understanding of things too. So then I gave the story to Dorothy and let her have the story, because I thought it might be more interesting actually to have a woman hitchhiker than to have a man hitchhiker. But yeah, part of it is intentional. So it was more intentional in that story, the idea of what does a sign like love sign sound? What color would that sound like? What color does kind of a weak mother sound like? What color might a boy sound like, a young boy sound like? They're breathing, as well as, like, what is grief? What color is grief? And I think purple is probably, to my mind, purple is kind of a grief color anyway. The color of bruise, the color, even though it's a beautiful, rich, wonderful color. And I don't think that grief is necessarily a bad thing, right? So to my mind, grief is kind of like purple in that it can be intense and it can be sort of like the color of a bruise, but it also has a richness to it. And so I think the recurring of purple particularly, is both, it's partly unintentional, but not dissociated from what I'm aware of in the story. But at the same time, it's also very much what I think about when I think about like the color of grief and the color of pain, and that that tricky part of grief and pain, which isn't necessarily all bad, right? So it's not like a black where it's the only thing. It's where there's this sort of levels of richness to it. Does that sound weird? That sounds weird. I'm weird.
No, it doesn't. And it's fascinating. And synesthesia is fascinating. And I think what it does in your stories, it just adds another texture, you know, because sometimes it's difficult to describe things like grief or the sound of someone's voice. And, if you're not including any sort of color, like it can be a challenge to really decipher like you said, the richness of it. And when you put in that bit of color, it just yeah, it just, I don't know, it makes the story richer, it makes the character richer, it makes me as a writer think about it too, like, or even just as a person, you know, you can easily get stuck on emotions, but what else is out there? What are we missing when we just get stuck on one sense or aspect of an experience like grief?
Thank you.
So I don't think that's weird at all.
Okay. Okay. And about the cover, I mean, I really imagine these stories as being like mid-century stories. So I was really intrigued with the mid-century palette, and that, and reaching out to the designers, who are fabulous. I kind of said I'm interested in the sort of the geometry and the color of the mid-century, and then that's what they came up with. So
Very cool. Yeah. Well, I want to get to one more thing. This is actually in the afterword. And I want to read one part of it that I love that maybe kind of speaks to what we were talking about just before, um, about writing with intention and paying attention and looking a little bit deeper into what things might look like or feel like. So in the afterword, you write, but when I turned off the radio like I did for most hours of every day, the silence that filled my cabin allowed me to pay close attention to the story unfolding, to the humanness of it, to the emotional pull of our country's narrative as it developed over those weeks, those months. In the quiet, I could, in fact, listen deep. And you're talking about one of your times away to do your writing, but um, in the last couple of readings I've done, that's come up a lot, like living with intention or listening or paying attention. And so, you talk about it in the afterword when it comes to writing. And I'm just curious, now you live right now in this very busy city. You can hear the horns honking and the people going by. And so when you're not in those quiet places where either you don't have access to the busyness of the internet or the TV or whatever, the radio, whatever, and you're able to find that quiet that takes you to a deeper part of the story, how do you um, how do you recreate that at home? Like, is there anything different that you do when you're around the hustle and bustle? Like, I'm just curious, like where that fits into your, like you say, when you finish your residency and you go back to real life, how are you able to recreate that? Oh,
okay, sorry, I muted myself because there were motorcycles riding by in the noise. I think, yeah. So how do you do that? Yeah, I try to. Some of it is practice. Some of it is practice in that I rarely use headphones or earplugs or any of that, because I find it sort of like, to me, it's equivalent to when you close your eyes. Sometimes teachers will say, close your eyes and imagine. And one of my teachers years ago said, if you close your eyes, you actually see less. You're seeing less with your eyes closed. And you think about how in the middle of the night, for instance, and you're worrying about something and you realize you're staring up at the ceiling, you're sort of seeing through open eyes. And I feel that to some extent, that's a practice that I have of listening through unencumbered ears. So even if I'm sitting here with my journal in the corner and there are sirens going by and cars going by, I practice listening to the talking to myself that I'm doing either on the page, or if I'm on a walk, I'm sort of telling myself stories. letting the noise, like letting the noise kind of turn down as I listen deep inside. And sure, occasionally the listening to the things outside are also interesting. We have a lot of shouty crackers, people up and down the street, in the middle of the night, and to me, that's a lot of interesting story. Or, we had a young couple across the hall, had a very tearful fight, once, and you hear the tones of that, and you hear the heartbreak, and to me, that's juicy story material, right? So I listen through the noise for the meaning, maybe to some extent, for the things for what's meaningful. And it really comes from practice. I think that if I walked with headphones on all the time, well, first of all, I would be listening, you're purposefully listening to something other than your own head, right? And then the other thing is that you are you're blocking out the possibility of something interesting coming to you through the world around you. So I think a lot of it is just this practice of being able to listen to myself. And we all know how to do this. I mean, remember when you were kids and your mom would say, Christy, hello, Christy. And the whole family was having dinner and stuff, but you'd been thinking about like this story that you wanted to write, or this game you were making up in your head, or, or whatever. So we all know how to do that. And I think that we don't trust that enough. I don't think we trust that listening in enough. That and to some extent it might be a little bit anti-American dream, in that, if you're daydreaming, or if you're letting your mind wander, or you're telling yourself stories, talking to yourself in your head, then you're not being productive. And as writers, I think we have to fight what other people consider productive all the time. So people are like, oh well, I got my audiobooks, and I put them on when I'm on a walk, and all that. And I'm like, yeah, I just like to walk when I'm on a walk. And
Right.
there's any, here I am judging other people's, whatever their process is. But my niece, for instance, whom I adore, she's my age, pretty much, just a couple of years younger than me, and she will always call me when she's out on a walk, because she has time. And I'm like, and I love to talk to her, but at the same time, it's sort of like, you don't need to talk to me while you're on a walk. You could talk to yourself.
Right. Yeah. I think that's and this somewhat has to do with create being a creative person in the world, but we've got so much coming at us, social media, emails, the day job, the blah, 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 that you're right. We take on that expectation that we always have to be doing something. And it's really, I think that's one thing, being at home so much and slowing down so much gives us that opportunity to think about how that works in our lives as people, as a family, but as a creative person as well. Like the benefit of taking that quiet and, like you said, being okay with it and trusting it instead of spinning out here in this whirlwind of what society tells us we need to do. And I know that's not necessarily discussing your stories, but I think it sounds to me like those kinds of philosophies and themes influence your stories and your writing quite a bit.
Yeah, they absolutely do. That, and the essay, the afterword there that you were talking about, was something that I had initially written pretty close to the time that I was in this cabin in the woods right after September 11th. And so there was all of this noise that you kind of had to listen through, right? And I was, but then it was when this next thing happened in March last year that it made me think again about, so it's time for me to start listening again. Yeah, and I think I'm not quite sure what the effect of that will be on the work that I'm eventually going to do, but it has been essential, and it's been welcome.
Would you be willing to read one more? I was thinking about the story No Worries. It's just it's a nice story. It's just kind of I don't know. I like it a lot, and I wondered if you'd be willing to read that as we near the end of the hour here.
Sure, let me find it. Yeah, it is one of my, it's probably, yeah, I won't say how it ends, but it is definitely not my usual way through a story. Um, but yeah, so it's called No Worries. You'd think he'd be too old for this sort of thing. Hell, that's what he thought. He'd met her in line at the shop, flustered and digging in her bag, looking for the extra bit of change to buy milk with. Just a little jug, enough to pour in her coffee, she said, talking to no one, to everyone, looking around and smiling at the clerk, at the woman in line a few folks back, at Jim, there directly behind her. Sorry, she'd said. She said it to him, and he nodded a little, like you do if you don't just look away, don't pretend it isn't happening, don't ignore someone else's embarrassment. No worries, he said. Why'd he say that? He never said that. His boy said that, only he wasn't a boy anymore, but a man now, off in the city, working long days for his family, his wife and little girl. But when he was a teenager, Danny, Jim's boy, said that. About everything. No worries, Dad. When Jim got on him to help his mother with the shopping, to get at those weeds in the garden. Sure, Dad, no worries. He was a good kid, Danny was. And when Rachel died and Danny came back home from university and missed his exams that year, he said it again. No worries, Dad. And together they went through Rachel's stuff and sorted it out and tossed some papers and old photos of family members neither of them knew, and took the rest, clothes, bags, shoes, to the charity shop. And then Danny went back to university, and then to the city where he got a job, got married, and so on. So most days, especially now that he wasn't working anymore, a pensioner, how'd he get to be that old, he wondered. Jim spent on his own, and he liked it that way, quiet. No one bothering him or needing anything. Not like Rachel had been particularly needy. But those last years when she got so sick and barely recognized him and couldn't do anything for herself anymore, cook, get dressed, bathe. Well, now not being needed was a bit of relief. Long morning walks through town, a stop for the paper and pleasantries at the shop, enough to keep Jim going, to feel something other than utterly alone. A routine, a ritual. But there she was, this one, the lady with the milk, throwing things just a little off. And why was that? Something in her face, maybe, her eyes, brown and soft. Kind? When was the last time Jim thought of that word? Kind, kindness. And so he slipped a hand in his pocket and pulled out £1 and put it on the counter in front of the woman. Let me, he said, and smiled at Alan behind the till, same as every morning. And he smiled at the woman too, and said again, no worries. She waited for him outside the door and made him promise that she could make it up to him. A drink, she said. And he could see the top of her head when she bent to write something on a small slip of paper, and there were gray hairs among the brown ones. She looked up again, handed him the paper with her name, Dorothy, and a number, the name of a cafe. Yes, she said, say 5 o'clock. She was American, he was pretty sure, even though she hadn't talked quite enough for him to know, to place the accent, but he was pretty sure anyway. He didn't know a lot of American women. Saw some on the telly though, smart mostly. He bought a new shirt, only it had been so long since he'd bought anything new, and before it had been Rachel who did most of the buying. So he got it a little small, a little tight around the middle. But it was bright white and sharp, he thought, when he looked in the mirror, smoothed down his eyebrows, plucked a couple of hairs out of his ears. And he sucked in his stomach and headed out the door for the cafe. It was just 4:30, and the place was close, but he didn't want to be late. Jim was not one for lateness. He got there early and stood for a bit at the door near the tables outside. He saw his reflection in the window and stood up taller, but thought he looked silly there, standing, shifting, foot to foot. Where should he put his hands? So he sat, ordered a glass of wine, waited, and she, Dorothy, he said it to himself, a rhythm in his head, Dorothy, 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 was late. And that's when he thought what he thought, that he was too old for this, well, whatever this was, meeting somebody, buying new clothes, waiting. He could be home now, sitting alone with something cold from the fridge, some crisps. That was good enough for most days, should be good enough for today. His palms were wet and his shirt was tight. And he was just about to pay up and go, 5:10 already. And then he saw her, Dorothy, hurrying around the corner, head down and feet quick and light on the pavement, her skirt dancing around her knees. She wasn't young herself, but she had a nice figure, Jim thought. She looked up and he saw the line of her neck stretch from her jaw to her collar, and he felt something like a shock, a spiral of something electric, something warm, something good. I'm too old for this, he muttered to the man, himself, reflected back from the window. And he nodded at the reflection and pushed up from the table and turned to Dorothy just as she reached the cafe, and she lifted her face to him, her cheek to be kissed. Here goes, he thought. No worries. And Jim bent down.
Thank you.
My
I think
pleasure.
that's just a fun story to end with, and it kind of, I was listening to you as I was listening to you read. It goes back to just a lot of different things that we've talked about throughout the hour. That idea of I'm too old for this, I'm too busy for this, I'm long past this. Just remembering that like revisions are so important no matter how old the story is. So I'm not long past this story enough that I can't go back and revise it. I'm not too old to look at exploring different ideas. And even if that's not your typical story, the fact that you still wrote it and you included it, I love that. And not too busy to just sit and be quiet and let the story unfold. So very cool.
Thank you.
um we're just at 3 o'clock, so if there's a question, you can pop it in the chat. But I want to thank you, Patty, for being here, for being patient with all the technical stuff that was happening, and giving up an hour on your Sunday afternoon. I really enjoyed this book. I hope that people will check it out. It's beautiful. And thank you to Cornerstone Press for bringing it out for us. And thank you to everybody who has been watching. Thanks so much.
Yep. And thank you, Catherine, and thank you for your smart comments too. And Christy, always a delight to talk to you. So thank you.
Yeah, you too.